A very special bonus episode of Locked On Rockets, as we are going to sit down with Chris Mannix and talk all things John Wall, Kevin Porter Jr., and Houston Rockets, coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start.
With the second pick in the 2021 NBA Draft, the Houston Rockets select Jalen Green.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal.
I'm going to keep working. I'm going to keep getting better every day. I'm going to keep perfecting my craft. And every time I step on that floor, I'm coming.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up, and welcome to another episode of Locked On Rockets, a bonus episode of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian, and also host of Locked On NBA Mondays. Be sure to follow along on Twitter at JT Gatlin, as well as the show at Locked On Rockets. And hey, we sincerely thank you for making Locked On Rockets your first listen each and every day. Joining us now is Sports Illustrated's Chris Mannix. Now, Chris, first off, how you doing today, man?
I'm good. I'm out here in Los Angeles. Escaped the snowstorm in the Northeast, so I'm off to a good start, at least this weekend.
All right. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Hopefully the new year's going well for you. And it's certainly taken a turn for the better for the Houston Rockets, given the events that started their new year. And we're going to get into some of that in just a moment. But I got to start off from the jump, Chris. Just be honest with me, level with me. How many Rockets games have you actually watched like this season?
So I watched probably 4 or 5 during the run early when I was writing some stuff about John Wall. I watched a couple of games during their winning streak in late November and early December, and probably towards the end of the year too. So less than 10, I would say, but somewhere between 6 and 8, I'm going to guess.
Okay. All right. And in those games, kind of earlier on, you just mentioned it, talking about the John Wall stuff. Where did the John Wall crusade kind of come from? Because that's the first point that I want to talk about with you is, you seem to think that the Rockets should, free him, play him, do something in that front. So where is that coming from?
Well, the John Wall stuff, to me, not playing John Wall is a form of tanking. And I have as much problem with the NBA kind of allowing the Rockets to do that as the Rockets actually doing it. Now, I do understand theoretically the logic behind it. John Wall has been a high usage rate player. And if you're developing Kevin Porter Jr., Jalen Green, some of the young guys on that team, you want to remove that from the equation. I don't know if I buy that necessarily. I don't think returning John Wall and playing him in somewhat of a reduced role would somehow hinder the progress of a Kevin Porter Jr. at that time, or somehow not give the Rockets organization enough evidence or enough body of work to figure out what they have in Kevin Porter Jr. before they have to decide on an extension. Quite frankly, how it looked to me and how it continues, frankly, to look to me is that Houston has removed a talented player from the mix in order to win less games. And look, that's been a strategy that's been employed many times in the NBA history, most recently with Philadelphia, which took tanking to an art form in recent years. But I'm never a proponent of tanking. If you have a player that is under contract for 2 years, the money's really irrelevant, but does make $40-something million per year, and he's not doing anything. He's healthy, he's active. And as we've known, didn't surprise me at all. Shortly after I wrote that story, we started hearing rumblings of John Wall wanting to play. This guy wants to get back to the mix, and the Rockets should be putting him back in the mix.
So on that front with the John Wall stuff, in your article specifically, you quoted and said, the idea that Wall would somehow stunt the progress of Porter and Green is ludicrous. And so kind of going off of that notion there with what you just said, it definitely would have to necessitate him coming back in a more reduced role. And so I think the issue there is that's not who John Wall is as a player. Unfortunately, some of Kevin Porter Jr.'s worst games last season, as the Rockets were first kind of getting him indoctrinated into the system and kind of seeing what they had with him after his brief stint with the RGV Vipers to kind of get him up to speed since he missed the first half of last season. They brought him in and they did try playing Kevin Porter Jr. and John Wall alongside each other. But John Wall is such a high usage guy who needs and wants the ball in his hands when he's on the floor. It was preventing Kevin Porter Jr. from having the ball in his hands for them to be able to really see and collect enough data points on whether or not he can be like the point guard of the future for this Houston Rockets team. So I would absolutely argue that maybe you get John Wall to buy into a slightly reduced role. Sure, but that's a pretty big maybe for an organization that really truly views and believes that Kevin Porter Jr. can be the point guard of the future for this team.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. One, I mean, like if you're going to be the point guard of this team, of a team that's going to win, you do have to be able to adjust to playing with a whole bunch of different players when you get into winning situations. I mean, Kevin Porter Jr. In a winning situation would not be the only high usage rate player on that team. I mean, Kevin Durant, not a bad example because they're great players, but Kevin Durant thrived with Russell Westbrook for many years over the time. I mean, players adjust to playing with other high usage rate players. And look, if John Wall didn't accept the role that Steven Silas and Rafael Stone gave him, that's a different conversation. Like if he came back and, was being a bad teammate and was grumbling about what role he was playing, well, then you have other options. Then you can suspend him. Then you could bench him. But to just kind of put him on the sidelines for the sake of Kevin Porter Jr. playing, let's not act like Kevin Porter Jr.'s played in every game. Like, there have been times that, John Wall probably would have been valuable for this team to have him healthy and ready to play. And if not valuable, at least you can't argue that in games that their backcourt's been banged up and guys have been out, he would have given the team a better chance to win. And him not being available took that piece off the table. That's my big issue. Like just letting him languish on the sidelines, not really in game shape, having not played in games in God knows how many months. I just think that part of it is wrong.
And, we had the agreement before the season, John Wall, Rafael Stone addressing the media saying, yeah, we're in agreement here. And then as you alluded to, there was the report that came out that John Wall did want to come back to play. And we haven't heard anything since then. That just, at this point, it just seems like it was Rich Paul and Clutch Sports just trying to stir up a little bit of something, a little bit of buzz around the John Wall situation. But ultimately, John Wall would be playing at this very moment if he were willing to come in and accept a reduced role with this Rockets team. Do you not agree? If he were willing to come off the bench and play the 12 to 15 minutes a night, the DJ Augustine spot minutes, a reserved role, as you've highlighted already, he would absolutely be playing. The reason he's not is because he wants to come back and he wants to be in a starting role. He wants to be a focal point. He wants to be able to.
Well, hold on. That's not like well, does he want that? I'm sure. Everything I've been told is that the message Wall has conveyed is that I want to play the minutes I'm earning, right? So if he's out there and he's playing at a high level, and last year was definitely a mixed bag for John Wall. I mean, coming off that injury, statistically those numbers were there, but the usage rate was really high. The shooting percentage, it may never be good for him. But John Wall's biggest sticking point is, look, if I'm on a hot streak and I'm scoring well, playing well, I want the opportunity to earn my role in the rotation. I don't think he wants to just be benched arbitrarily because it's time to throw this guy into the fire. And I think that's a fair argument. I mean, the NBA should be a meritocracy. And I honestly don't believe that Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green's their development would be stunted if a better playing John Wall is getting a few more minutes per game more than them this season. Like that argument to me, Jackson, is ludicrous. Like I keep using that word ludicrous. It does strike me like these guys need to just be force-fed minutes when they're playing like crap, or if they're playing like crap. I don't buy that at all. I think if John Wall if John Wall is playing well, he wanted to be out there and be able to play minutes that he feels like he's earned. That's where I think he and the Rockets have reached an impasse.
And as far as, earning those minutes, it is unfortunate, right, that if he agreed to the situation at hand, primarily, before the season started with Rafael Stone, he agreed to not playing, right, to sitting out. And,
Well, I
we're
think
not
too.
gonna,
I think one thing I think is that I do think that John Wall's team might have misread the market a little bit. I think they thought last year the way he played showed he was healthy at the very least. Not the same all-star player we used to see in Washington, but showed he was a healthy guy. I think they believed there would be a market for him, whether it was Miami or somewhere else. Like that somebody would make a play for him at this point. And as you know, that there have been no talks about John Wall. There's really no interest whatsoever in John Wall. So I think there's the mistake. I mean, where John Wall should have just said, effectively kick rocks. Like, I'm not going to sit out. I mean, John's played I think 113 games over the last 4-ish years or whatever it is. Like, he should not be voluntarily sitting on the sideline. So I think they believe that there would be a trade that would materialize at least before February. And to my knowledge, there's nothing out there available.
Yeah. And so you can go back to that decision at the start of the season, and whether that's the fault of him personally, his camp, whoever it may be, that decision was made. And so then that was an impasse in the road that they got past, and they decided, okay, we're going to allocate these minutes to Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green moving forward. And ultimately, I think that when you look at the situation, that contract that John Wall is on, that contract does not guarantee him minutes. That doesn't guarantee him a spot in the rotation. And I think he kind of forfeited that opportunity to potentially fight for a spot in the rotation by agreeing at the offset of the season, hey, fine, I'll sit out. You guys want me to sit out? We want to find a trade partner. We're going to do all that. But now, midway through the season, the Rockets are firmly well into their developmental plan with Kevin Porter Jr., Jalen Green, Josh Christopher, guys like that. They're clearly rebuilding, clearly trying to focus on the development of the young guys. And now John Wall suddenly wants back in. That doesn't sit right with me.
I don't dispute that part of it. I think we can agree that the decision to voluntarily sit out from John Wall's part made no sense. I don't know every detail about why he decided to do that, but that was a mistake. All that being said, look, stranger things have happened, I guess, but I don't see a trade partner emerging for John Wall during the duration of this contract. I just don't. I mean, maybe, just maybe next summer, somebody goes crazy and says, look, I want more than anything, I want that money that's going to come off the books for John Wall in 2023. So I'll trade you this kind of poo-poo platter of players to get John Wall off your. I just don't see that happening, though. So in that situation, I would just cut him. You're going to wind up eating. I mean, I don't know what kind of buyout you can negotiate with him. And every time you hear about John Wall won't take a nickel less, everything's negotiable in these types of situations. But if you're the Rockets, I don't know why you just don't move on from him. I don't see a trade happening before the trade deadline at some point next summer. Again, I could be wrong, but that contract, this player, the landscape in the NBA, I mean, he was only traded the first time because the Rockets had an equally distressed asset to give Washington to go and get him. I just don't see. I mean, I guess unless you want to do Russell Westbrook 2.0, I don't see that situation unfolding again. So I mean, to solve the problem, I would just sit in the room and figure out a way to save a couple of bucks with John Wall and walk away from his contract.
Yeah, and I think that, again, this comes back to, right, is John Wall willing to negotiate a buyout? Because if he were willing to give up X amount of money right now, today, I'm sure that the Rockets would absolutely pick up the phone and listen, and that he and Rafael Stone could, lock themselves in a room and negotiate it with his agent, whoever else, right, and figure out a solution to this current dilemma. But I think something that is worth noting, Chris, here is that John Wall has been engaged, right? He's been on the sidelines. He's been coaching up the Rockets' young players. He's been in the ears of Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green at practice. They talk constantly about how impactful he has been to their development. And so it's not like John Wall has just been given his payday and said, all right, go, hang out in the corner of Toyota Center. We don't want to see you. He's very much been involved with the team. He's been impactful. He's been, embracing a veteran leadership role. The only thing he's not doing is playing in these games. And again, that was something that he agreed to.
I mean, yeah, you're right. But that's kind of like, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how is the play? Like, he's not playing in games. Like, he's not actually out there on the floor, contributing or trying to contribute to this team. And I go back to something I said earlier about John Wall not being active. Like, in a best case scenario, you've got Porter You've got Green. You've got Josh Christopher, active and healthy, able to play 30-ish minutes every single night. But you and I both know that's not how the NBA works. And it certainly doesn't work now during the time of constant guys winding up and health and safety protocols. Hell, then that just brought Kyrie Irving back in part for that reason, to have a healthy body there. I mean, I just feel like you've
part-time
got
Kyrie Irving at that. So
part-time, well, that's a different conversation altogether. But when all this started to unfold, I started to think like maybe this is a reason for the Rockets to bring back John Wall. But again, John Wall, in my mind, has the potential to impact winning. I just don't seem to think the Rockets want anything to do with that this season. Like, and look, it's a strategy. You're developing young players. You're going to wind up with whoever it is, Jabari Smith, Chet Holmgren, whoever that may be at the top of the draft. I get that much, but like not bringing John Wall back during all these turbulent times when guys are rolling in and out of the lineups and you're starting at times G Leaguer. How Gerald Green just like reactivated himself and sent himself down to the G League. I mean, like this, I just feel like this would have been an opportune moment to bring John Wall back into the mix, but it's not happening. And it's one of the more, as we sit here and talk about it, I mean, I kind of forgotten about that a little bit over the last few weeks since I wrote that story, a month and a half ago, 2 months ago now, but like, it still is kind of vexing that you've got a healthy body there in a league where healthy bodies are at a premium at the moment. And he's just sitting there not active.
My counter to the idea that the Rockets are sitting John Wall to intentionally tank, because I absolutely do not believe for 1 second that that's the modus operandi behind what the front office is doing. It truly, to me, is because of the development of the young guys that they have on the roster, and because they wanted to place a priority on their backcourt of the future of Kevin Porter Jr., Jalen Green. Steven Silas, much to the chagrin of Rockets fans everywhere, has actually made some, choices throughout this season in moments to, go with veterans in big moments trying to win games. So it's not like they're absolutely out there, right? If they wanted to intentionally tank, right, they wouldn't be running Daniel Tice any run, right? They'd be letting Alperen Şengün get 30 plus minutes a night. They'd be starting Alperen Şengün over, Daniel Tice for the first 17 or so games of the season. This wasn't a team that out of the gate was like, you know what, we're coming out here and we're just going to try and bottom out and aim for a top 3 pick. Things didn't work out with the Daniel Tice Christian Wood pairing in the front court, and it probably took a little bit longer for them to realize than they should have to 86 that pairing. But this team isn't walking out there intentionally trying to lose games. This is not the process era Sixers at all.
It's not. I mean, they couldn't be. The process era Sixers, had talent on paper. They had talent on paper, but none of those guys were on the floor, especially in those first few years. I do think the Rockets believed internally that they were going to be a lot better this year. Like, I don't think they thought they'd be a playoff team this year, but didn't think they believed they'd be what, as we talk currently, worst record of the Western Conference, 3rd or 4th worst in the NBA. I thought they believed they'd be a lot better. And when it comes to guys like Steven Silas, I'm seeing it a lot in Boston with Ime Udoka. Young coaches kind of reflexively go to veterans in key situations. They know, like, in their minds, they probably know it's, we got to develop these young guys. But when you've got a Daniel Tice on the bench, when you've got some veterans that you can go to, they're going to lean on guys like that in clutch situations, because they believe that gives them the best chance to win. But look, the season is an evolving thing, right? Like, what the Rockets thought they were back in October, early November is not what they are right now. And it's been almost half a season officially at this point. We're right there at that midway point of 41 games or close to it. Like, I think what Kevin Porter Jr. is. I don't believe that you're going to hurt him. Like, if you're keeping him around, I don't think you're going to hurt him by bringing John Wall back into the mix and trying to win a few more games. That's where I come down. I'm not saying it's the process Sixers, but if we boil it down right now in this moment, does John Wall help them win games? I believe the answer is yes. And I think a lot of Rockets fans, maybe it's you too, believe the answer is no.
No, if you're asking me right now, if John Wall were to be brought back tomorrow, would John Wall help this team be better on the floor? I have no argument there. John Wall absolutely probably would help this team be a better on the court product, but I don't think that helps Kevin Porter Jr.'s development, and I don't think it helps Jalen Green's development. Actually, I'll bet.
You think it really? Let me ask this. You think it? Yeah, Green's different. Yeah, but you think it really I don't really get that argument. Like, if you're not that you gain a ton from just having a veteran in front of you and watching him kind of do it, but I don't believe in I don't ascribe to the philosophy that you should just be spoon fed everything, right? Like, so, Kevin Porter Jr. has been around the league for a few years now. Like, he had a good run with Houston last season. Like, John Wall's not what John Wall used to be. It should be Kevin Porter Jr. should look at John Wall as like in-house competition. Like, I got to beat this guy out for minutes. I think that sharpens you as well. Like, I think that gives you an edge. Being able to beat out the former All-Star, the guy that was one of the top point guards in the league at one time. I don't like if you don't have like DJ Augustin's not pushing Kevin Porter in the way that John Wall would. I think there's something to practice competition and fighting for minutes and not just being handed opportunities because a team wants to see what you have. I think there's a benefit there. Maybe it manifests itself in fewer minutes for a Kevin Porter, but I think if you have to, this guy has to beat out John Wall, I think that benefits him too.
I could absolutely subscribe to that notion, for a guy who is being brought in, right? A rookie trying to earn his stripes, right? Coming in, a fresh draft pick, that kind of thing. But that's not the situation with Kevin Porter Jr. The Rockets kind of saw the talent there. They understood they're taking a flyer on him based on, what had gone on with his stint with the Cleveland Cavaliers, getting him for a top, 55 protected second rounder, basically, for nothing. And they knew that he was a reclamation project coming in, but they saw the talent there. And I think that's exactly what they did last season, right? Is they had the half season mark to kind of gauge, okay, what is Kevin Porter Jr.? How do we think we can play him? What do we think we have with this guy? And after looking at what they did last season with him, this offseason, they decided, you know what? We think he's talented enough and capable enough to play the point for this team full time. So they had already gone through that valuation process of, okay, we're not going to force Kevin Porter Jr. to earn his minutes behind a John Wall. And so I would say
that everybody should have to earn their minutes. Like, every player in the league, top players earn their minutes. I mean, unless you're like Giannis or Steph Curry or Kevin Durant, it's a meritocracy in the NBA. Nobody's handed any kind of minutes. We see lineups shaken up all the time, especially on teams that are struggling. I mean, like, that's not unusual. I mean, I don't feel like just because Kevin Porter went through 1 year, 1+ years now with this team, that all of a sudden he's just earned this starting point guard role, just be handed it to him. I mean, that's not how it works with like virtually every other team out there.
But again, you go back to last season, and they already went through the attempted effort to see what John Wall and Kevin Porter Jr. on the floor would look like. They got enough data.
How many games was that? Like how many games was that in a bizarro season? Like I mean, like in John Wall's first season back after missing 2 years with a leg injury. Like, I'd like to give him a full off season with that team. Maybe that work out. I don't know, whatever they were doing in the offseason, what they should have been doing in the offseason, figuring out how to make it work together. That's just, to me, last season, 4 games in 5 nights, John Wall's injury, all the new moving pieces, the James Harden crap that went on in Houston last year. I mean, that to me is not like a functional environment to be able to assess what you have with that backcourt, including John Wall.
Yeah, well, and thankfully Kevin Porter Jr. wasn't even in Houston at the time of the whole James Harden situation. We're not even 1 full calendar year removed from that. This situation is crazy, and James Harden.
Time is a flat circle.
Yeah. It really is. Jeremy Bearimy, man. But as far as this season goes, unfortunately, the Rockets had the double big lineup to start this season. They were running Daniel Tice, Christian Wood, and that pairing not only dampened those guys' numbers and made the front court look atrocious, unfortunately, it reduced the effectiveness of everybody on the floor. Kevin Porter Jr. struggled. Jalen Green struggled. The Rockets looked really, really bad to start this season. And then they 86'd it. They moved away from it. They put Christian Wood back at the 5, as they should have done. And suddenly Kevin Porter Jr. looked like an adequate point guard again. In the games since the Rockets got rid of the double big lineup and Kevin Porter Jr. has been back in, he's averaging 7 assists a night and only a hair over 3 turnovers a game. That's progress. That's progress that could not be had John Wall been in the lineup, because you're not going to see Kevin Porter Jr. running and orchestrating the offense 30+ minutes a night.
I mean, maybe like if he's playing like that, I think a head coach will keep him in the game. And if he's not capable of playing like that because there's competition there for him, then maybe he should be playing the game. I can't get on board with that argument, because I'm trying to think of examples right now of guys kind of hopping over each other in the current NBA. I mean, there's so many lineup changes in the last month for different reasons, but like young guys, when they struggle, sometimes they get benched. And if you're not mentally tough enough to kind of be able to absorb that and learn from it and work on your game and get better, like John Wall is not the John Wall from 5 years ago. Like if Kevin Porter Jr. is any good, he should be able to pass him in the rotation. And again, he's not playing every game. He's had games where he's been out. Jalen Green has been out. The backcourt's been in flux at times, like it has been with every other team in the league. Like not having John Wall there, it comes back to the full circle. Not having John Wall there, I believe, has cost this team wins. Maybe not a lot of wins, but 1 or 2 or 3 wins on the season. That may be nothing, but it's the old Herm Edwards line. Like you play to win the games, and not having John Wall out there playing, I think, has negatively impacted the Rockets' ability to win games.
So in this whole thing, we've touched on him a couple times here while debating the John Wall stuff. Why so quick to give up on Kevin Porter Jr.?
Well, it's both Kevin Porter Jr. and Christian Wood at this point, because it's twofold. One, like what happened the other night, that's I haven't really even heard of something like that happening, where a guy, you can't use any word other than quit for what happened with Kevin Porter Jr. and Christian Wood. Like they effectively quit on their team. Down 22 at halftime against the Nuggets team that, while good, still you can come back and beat the Denver Nuggets. And they just decided they weren't going to play. Now we can debate the semantics, how it all happened. What did Stephen Silas say to Christian Wood? What did Christian Wood say to Stephen Silas? What happened in the locker room between John Lucas and Kevin Porter Jr.? I don't know, but quitting is like the cardinal sin in the NBA. And, John Lucas, as you well know, like one of the most respected people in the entire NBA, not just for his 4 decades of service as a player and a coach, but what he's done to help athletes, not just NBA players, but athletes become the best version of themselves. Like his track record is unbelievable. So if John Lucas is blowing up at you, I'm guessing that's not the first time you've done something that John Lucas has not liked, and that would lead him to that point. So that, like, short term, like quitting, I think that's unacceptable. I don't know how you come back from that. I know they won, Kevin Porter Jr., big shot, great moment, all that, but over the rest of the season, I don't know how you really come back from that, how you can regain the trust of players in that locker room, or what they say publicly now. I don't know how you can regain the trust of players in the locker room. As I was starting to write the column, like you start to play it out a little bit, right? Like this all happened this season, and what we've seen and what's actually gone on behind the scenes are probably 2 different things. Like there's probably more to these stories that have gone on that have not been revealed publicly. You've got Kevin Porter Jr., who is extension eligible at the end of the season. We all know that. We just talked about the Rockets giving him opportunities to play to see what they have in him. Is there any scenario? I'm asking, like you're close to this team, you watch the team closer than I do, but is there any scenario where the Houston Rockets are going to offer Kevin Porter Jr. any real money at the end of the season? I can't see it. Not after what we've seen happen after that incident just happened there. That's way too big a risk to attach yourself to 3 years, and I don't even know what the number would be for that he'd be looking for. Christian Wood, same thing. 1 year left in his contract, extension eligible at the end of this season. He's going to be looking for real money, and I get that if you're Christian Wood, because no matter what's been going on this season, a center with his skill set, he can get teams interested. There could be a bidding war. So, but if you're Houston, can you commit franchise money to a player like that? If he's looking for, maybe not max money, but $15, $20 million per season, whatever it may be on a long-term contract. Let's assume the answer to those questions is no. Now you're talking about going into next season with another with Jalen Green in his second year, with Sengun in his second year, with Jae'Sean Tate and whoever you draft over there, with 2 guys in a contract year. That's not a good situation, because if you've got 2 guys in a contract year that maybe don't look at themselves as being part of what this team is going to do long term, that lends itself to bad situations where you have guys playing for numbers instead of playing for wins. And that, to me, as I kind of wrap up this point, like that to me potentially impacts the development of the guys that you know are going to be around there long term. You just talked to me for 20 minutes now about the importance of developing guys, of putting these guys in the best possible environment. I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to convince me that Porter Jr. and Wood on contract years next year, in that environment, is going to be a good one for Green, Sengun, draft pick, Tate. That is almost, to me, it feels like it's almost sabotaging the season before it even starts. So, Christian Wood, there is a market for him. There's a number of teams out there. I listed them in the column I wrote. Charlotte would love to get their hands on him. You got Portland would love to get their hands on him. The Lakers, they want to get their hands on everybody right now, and they would be a team that would be in the mix. Porter, not a big number to eat, in part because Cleveland, and I know you know this, but Cleveland gave him like the world's crappiest first-round pick contract, the lowest number they could possibly give him to in order to draft him in that first round a couple of years ago. So you're not eating a substantial number there. I'm now sounding like you here. Like I'm going in this direction where I'm like focusing on the development. I just don't see, because of everything that's happened, Porter Jr. and Wood being part of what this team's going to do long term. And if that's the case, I think it should be the case, you've got to lock in on what's going to make Green and company better. And I don't think a contract year situation with Porter and Wood is what makes them better.
So definitely a lot to unpack there. And I'll kind of go back to the start where you talked about John Lucas, right? And that relationship that he has with Kevin Porter Jr. The moment this incident, this halftime, drama, whatever we want to call it, happened, I was immediately thinking, okay, one, this is, very akin to the situation that happened last season that was completely blown out of proportion with Jae'Sean Tate throwing a basketball at James Harden. That made national headlines. It was everywhere. Everybody was freaking out about it. It was just two guys competing in practice. That's what it was. And I'm not like trying to downplay the situation at all for Wood or for Kevin Porter Jr., although I do want to focus on KPJ here. Because I'm on the same boat as you. I'd like to see the Rockets trade Christian Wood. That's where we're at there. So I'm not going to focus on Christian Wood. But with Kevin Porter Jr., I'm not trying to downplay the fact that what happened. He quit on the team, right? He left the team, left at halftime, whatever the actual specifics of that, situation are, some of the details have come to light about what actually took place. We're never going to know the exact full story. We're never going to know the specific exchanges that happened, who called out who, like all these things. All we know is they went back into the locker room. John Lucas called out Kevin Porter Jr. and Christian Wood. Kevin Porter Jr. lost his temper and he left at halftime, right? This is a guy, Kevin Porter Jr., who struggled with his emotions in the past, who struggled, with off the court issues before. And it's very possible that in this situation, having been in a situation like this before, having dealt with situations like this before, Kevin Porter Jr. just thought the best thing for him to do would be to remove himself from the situation, right? Before further damaging any relationships with his teammates, with his coaching staff, what have you. But when it comes to John Lucas and Kevin Porter Jr., John Lucas is like the old school style, like enforcer. He calls out everybody like that. Like that's just who his coaching style is. When I go to Rockets practices at Toyota Center, like John Lucas is out there like cussing, swearing at the players. Like that's his style, right? He's the bad cop, right? You've got Steven Silas, the good cop, John Lucas, the bad cop. So I don't view it as something where, John Lucas was rubbed the wrong way and, was calling out Kevin Porter Jr. and it was something, a personal indictment of who he is or what he was doing. It was John Lucas as the coach wanting to get the best out of Kevin Porter Jr. And they've spoken so highly about each other. John Lucas views Kevin Porter so highly. Kevin Porter Jr. has said that he loves John Lucas, that John Lucas means the world to him, that he has helped really turn his career around. And I don't think that's something you just cast aside at the first sign of trouble. Like this, yes, this is a significant situation and it's a bump in the road and it needs to be addressed. And they did address it and they're addressing it in-house. And you see that the way that Steven Silas is handling this, and I think it's commendable, the way that he has responded to this situation, because they could have just cast him out, right? They could have just said, you know what? Oh, you quit. Okay. What? You left at halftime? We're going to cut you. We're going to bench you. We're going to do all that. For somebody who struggled with his confidence and struggled with trying to find his place in the NBA, what kind of a message would that send to him? But instead, you've got an organization that's going to double down and say, hey, we know you made a mistake. We understand. We want you to learn from this and grow from this and continue on the path that we think you can be on as an NBA player. That's huge to me.
Oh, okay.
And that speaks volumes about the culture that the Rockets are truly building here in Houston, which was another knock, saying that the culture in Houston is a problem. And nobody was talking about Houston's culture before this one isolated incident.
Well, I mean, a little bit they were. Like the wall stuff, it got people around the league talking about, like, what is the mindset here? Like, and when, the guys that Houston has brought in over the last couple of years, from DeMarcus Cousins, if you go back to last year, to, Porter Jr. and Christian Wood, who had a lot of red flags around him when the Rockets signed him. Like, he was available for that number in part because of some of the off the court issues that were not the off the court issues, but like attitude issues, I think were the ways that I would probably best describe it. I get, look, Lucas is a fiery guy, but from what I understand, and I've talked to a few people connected to the situation that happened, that this wasn't Lucas, just kind of yelling at a guy for not getting back on defense at a practice. This was, I don't know all the specifics about what happened with that incident, but this was serious in the locker room. And I strongly disagree with I think he said something to the effect of, like, Porter decided the best thing for him and his teammates was to step away. No, the best thing for you and your teammates is to, knuckle down and go out there and try to help the team win. It's not to not go out and play. Like, I don't get that at all. Like, if you want to show your teammates that you're engaged, like, this whole thing blew up, in part, according to all the reporting that's been done, because there was some people upset. Lucas was upset. I believe the Athletic also reported, like, one of the young players was upset at some of the effort that was being given out there. You want to make it up to your teammates, do the exact opposite. Go out there and get. I mean, I wasn't watching that game in real time against Denver, but I'm sure you could see a pretty lackadaisical effort in that first half from everybody. If you're down 22, that's often part of the reason. Don't not play like that. That to me is the worst thing you can possibly do. Don't leave the arena. Don't whatever it was that he did. Don't do that. Go out there and play, and go out there and help your team win. I mean, look, we keep coming back to, like, we're just talking about how this guy's got to be, they want this guy to be the point guard of the future. They want to see what they have in this guy. Can he be a part of this team's core long term? Does that scream to you he should be? I know you're pointing to, like, one mistake, but it's one mistake that we know of with Houston. It was a whole bunch of mistakes that we know of with Cleveland. We've now got a pretty good pattern here. And again, I kind of keep pushing it forward, being like, I'll ask you this, like, I'm making numbers up at this point, but he goes into the offseason and says, look, I want a $36 million over 3 extension, something like that. That'll be basically a 4-year deal because it gets tacked on to the next contract. Like, are you giving him that? Like, are you tying yourself based on what you've seen in the last season and a half on top of this last incident to Kevin Porter Jr.? I wouldn't. And maybe that's where opinions diverge between me and people like you that cover the Rockets and people that watch the Rockets, but I wouldn't do it. Not after what I've seen in this incident.
No, I think that in this moment, right, Kevin Porter Jr. absolutely probably cost himself some money, right? Whether he cost himself, the opportunity for an extension, whether it's, he just cost himself some money off of a potential extension. I absolutely think this incident is something to be concerned about, and something that is, something you don't just cast aside. You don't pretend it's nothing. But I also don't think you overreact to the situation. I think that's exactly what Stephen Silas vocalized when, addressing the media and really trying to, take the situation by the horns and figure out, okay, what are we doing here?
But Jackson, I would say this too, like, and I don't know what Stephen Silas really thinks about this. Whatever coaches say on the record, I very infrequently take as gospel, right? Like, like what Stephen Silas did was absolutely the right thing. Like, he had to diffuse the situation. He had to find a way to make sure that he puts this team in the best chance to be able to move forward with this group, knowing probably that the Rockets were not going to take, the advice of, Sports Illustrated columnist and say, just let people go. So he did what he had to do. Does that mean that Stephen Silas really believes all that? I don't know. I mean, there's been a lot. I mean, you've been around covering these. Like, there's a lot of times, what coaches say on the record is not what they feel off the record. It's just kind of the way it goes in the NBA. Like Stephen, who, as I wrote, I am a massive Stephen Silas fan. I think he's one of the best young coaches of the NBA. I really hope he doesn't get scapegoated for the struggles of the last 2 seasons. But like any other coach, I think he's doing what he has to do to get this team, get the ship righted, at least temporarily, to try to move forward past these incidents. Does he really believe that, Kevin Porter Jr. should be kept around, that Wood should be kept around? Those guys, I don't know the answer to that. I don't believe what a coach says publicly is necessarily what they actually believe.
Well, on that front, the organization is absolutely still incredibly, attached to Kevin Porter Jr. That much I know for certain. They don't view the situation as some, gigantic, red mark on what has happened. Is it a situation?
Where were you on but where were you? Let me ask you this. Where were you on this is a sort of a separate topic, but what is Stephen Silas doing out there just taking these hand grenades for this team? How many bullets does Stephen Silas have to take for situations that were really not of his making? I think Rafael Stone is a very smart basketball guy. The Sengun pick was excellent. You got to hit on those picks to be a successful team in the NBA. But why is Stephen Silas sitting up there by himself in these situations? I'm not saying that Stone should have done it alone. I think the coach has to be involved because the coach has to show the locker room that he's the one in charge in these situations. But the second that happened in Denver or in Houston against Denver, knowing there would be suspensions coming, if I was Rafael Stone, I would have been on that team playing. I'm not sure, was he out scouting? I would have been on my way to Philadelphia to sit side by side with Stephen Silas to address this as a united front. I can't get over the fact that, and again, I wrote this, whether it's James Harden thing is devolving, here's Stephen Silas. The John Wall thing kind of blows up, here's Stephen Silas. All this happens last week, here's Stephen Silas. It is the general, and I know other executives that I've talked to about this, who I ran this by, agree with me, is the general manager's responsibility to take these hits with your head coach when something like this blows up. I don't know why Stephen is out there doing it all by himself.
That's a solid question. Where is Rafael Stone in all this? But I think it also shows that Rafael Stone trusts Stephen Silas to handle the situation accordingly. Is that not?
Yeah, but that's not. That's not
is that
real.
not your general
manager?
Is that not your general manager empowering your head coach to have him be the leader of the locker room? That's not a way to look at this situation.
I don't think those things are mutually exclusive, right? I don't think it. What's the word? Depower. Maybe the wrong word there. I don't think it unempowers Stephen Silas if Rafael Stone is sitting alongside him answering questions in situations like this. I mean, some general managers are more accessible than others. I understand that. But, if they're, how many times, I use, for example, I think in Golden State, Bob Myers, when something pops up, he's the one often addressing the media. Is Bob Myers undercutting Steve Kerr in situations like that? I don't think so. I just feel like you've got to be, it's part of your job to be there out in front, not alone. I agree with you. If he's up there by himself and Stephen Silas in the locker room and Rafael Stone's announcing suspensions and taking questions alone, that's not good. That does, but sitting side by side with your head coach, I think that is part of your responsibilities as a general manager.
At the same time, I think you can very clearly just look at it and say this Rockets organization, while it's a situation that they're handling and that they're going to work past with Kevin Porter Jr. and with Christian Wood for the time being, as long as he remains a member of the Houston Rockets, they didn't view it as a situation that warranted having the general manager be propped up next to the head coach to address the situation, right? They viewed it as what it was. Kevin Porter Jr. lost his temper, a situation occurred, and then they handled it, right? And they came back out. And I think that's something that is so clearly evident is, you've mentioned the trust factor, right? Between these teammates and how can they trust going forward, Christian Wood and Kevin Porter Jr. and how can that locker room actually, gel and be okay? These guys fight and play hard for each other. This locker room is incredibly close, even through the 15-game losing streak. And I'm not talking just player, post-game interviews, right? The fluff for the media, right? I'm talking walking around Toyota Center. You see these players interacting with each other. They're chopping up on social. These guys like each other. They are a close-knit group of guys. And I don't think this situation is going to derail that. And you can see just how close they are it was almost like a story, not a storybook ending, but for Kevin Porter Jr. to come back in his first game back after this suspension, after this whole situation, to be able to come back and have that opportunity to be trusted by head coach Steven Silas with the ball in his hands, final play of the game is on the line, to make the right decision, to then be given the opportunity to hit the game winner and to make it, and to then be mobbed by his team and by Silas and John Lucas at midcourt after that game winner. It was huge. And to have that moment, to be able to look back on that and have that confidence that, hey, look, Steven Silas can now say to him, look, I trusted you in this moment, right? We had this thing happen. You came back, you apologized. We're good. We're square. The locker room is whole. And I'm going to trust you to go out there and do your job. That's huge for Kevin Porter Jr.'s development.
Okay. All right. I think great moment. No question for Kevin Porter Jr. And believe me, I heard from every Rockets fan on social media after that. I saw it all coming through there after that shot. It's one game. It's against Washington. All right. If this team rattles off, I'll promise you this, like on the record, if this team rattles off like 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10 of the next 10 games, I will write a whole separate story on that specifically, like banding back together, that storyline entirely. I'm just not going to, like, all right, if there are two ends of the spectrum then, right? If you're telling me not to believe that 2 players quitting on the team against Denver is evidence of what this team really is and how they really feel about each other, because if you look just at that game, your argument that they fight for each other doesn't hold up. They didn't fight for each other in that game. They quite literally quit. 2 of them quit on the team in that game. Similarly, and I'm not saying it shouldn't just be on one game, but the same thing with Washington. Like, tremendous moment, like amazing, like, great shot. You feel good for Kevin Porter Jr. to come back and do something like that, but you got to start seeing. There's gonna be, it's gonna be tough times ahead. Like, this team is not all of a sudden gonna turn back to being the team we saw during that 7-game stretch or whatever it was in November, December. Like, there's a rocky road ahead of them. How they band together and stick together, if they're able to do that to me will be revealing. So I love the moment, but I'm gonna need to see a little bit more evidence before I'm on board with this team now, with kind of that Lego movie, everything is awesome theme being played in the locker room.
No, and I think that if you do look at this moment from this situation, if you kind of do read between the lines a little bit for how the Rockets have handled this and how they've addressed it, one of the very first things that Steven Silas said is that the situations with Christian Wood and Kevin Porter Jr. are 2 very different situations, and they're kind of being lumped together because they happened during the same game. And I think if you're looking for a catalyst for what took place during this game, I think you have to point the finger at Christian Wood. And I think that if I'm being completely honest here, right, that is probably the guy in the locker room that has been kind of out for himself a little bit this season, at times freezes other guys out of the offense, right? So as a whole, I don't think that Kevin Porter Jr. is inherently going to be a negative or a detrimental to the future of the guys that you pointed out earlier, right? Jalen Green, Alperen Sengun, Josh Christopher. In this moment, the context behind what happened in that Denver Nuggets game, right? Christian Wood broke a team rule, quote unquote. So he was benched to start the game. So he comes in, he checks in, into the first quarter, whatever, 3-4 minutes left, and comes in and he gives a very lackadaisical effort about, playing the game, goes 0-4, it plays 8 minutes, isn't really trying super hard. That, I believe, was more so the catalyst. And then obviously the Nuggets reeling off a bunch of points in a row and really taking control of the game. The Rockets started off that game playing hot. They looked great. They were up, at one point 28-16, 28-18 on the Nuggets. First quarter looking really, really good. Bench unit came in alongside Christian Wood, and Christian Wood kind of mailed it in a little bit. And so I think you can very easily kind of extrapolate and say, okay, that's very much exactly why there were frustrations at halftime, is because this team came out of the gate looking really good. Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green were putting on a show in the first quarter. Christian Wood comes in and mails it in. And then they go back at halftime and they're trailing double-digit lead at halftime. What's happening? Who's getting called out? A young player calls out Christian Wood. We don't know who it was. Maybe it was Jae'Sean Tate. Maybe it was Josh Christopher. Who knows, right? But that's the issue there. And so I think that you can very much look at this situation and think that it was the team frustrated with Christian Wood's effort, and the coaches were calling not only him out, but also the responsive effort from KPJ, from the rest of the team as well, because everybody got called out. It was those 2 names in particular, though, that made headlines. The team's response to how the Denver Nuggets reeled off that lead. And so now it's become this big story. But internally, this is something, right? Disagreements happen. And yes, this one escalated to a point that it made, national headlines, but at least internally, the Rockets view it as something that can be worked past.
It escalated I mean, again, to be blunt, because two guys quit. Like that's why I didn't that look, fights happen in the locker room constantly. I mean, I spent 8 years as a kid as working as a ball boy back in Boston for the Celtics. Like I saw fights. Like I saw some knockdown dragouts in both the home and visiting locker room. I have no problem with guys kind of throwing down with each other. Like heat of battle, 82 game season. I get that. My problem is quitting. Like you get into a fight with the guy in your locker room at halftime, you better get your ass back out there and play hard in the second half. The two guys that didn't play, that didn't go back out there. That, again, it's kind of what I said right at the top. That is kind of like the cardinal sin in the NBA. And I want to ask you this, like, how I kind of frame this, and how I said this to you earlier, like, if you're not going to pay Kevin Porter Jr. this offseason, we'll keep the focus on him. That's fine. I think we do agree on Christian Wood, and like, let's find a way to get something in return for him before the trade deadline. If he goes into next season without a contract, do you feel comfortable with that? Would you be fine with last year of his deal, Kevin Porter Jr., on a young team that's trying to grow together?
Yeah. At this point, again, one isolated incident that we know of, and past that, you can look at the growth that he's had since joining the Houston Rockets. He was leading scrimmages this offseason, voluntary, come in, all offseason, leading guys, Armani Brooks, the other young guys that the Rockets were cultivating, really trying to, build something here in Houston. He was just at Toyota Center, just getting shots up, working out, trying to really take this, even though he himself, right, he hasn't even logged 2 full seasons of calendar games, right? He's still, for all intents and purposes, he's like in his sophomore season as far as actual games played. So I think that's a big part, is Kevin Porter Jr. is still trying to figure out who he is as an NBA player. And he walks into the Rockets organization. They embrace him, open arms. We understand you come with a troubled past. We're going to try and help you work past that. I don't have an issue with Kevin Porter Jr. going into a contract year next season, right? He may have cost himself that extension, right? That's exactly what this year was for, is for the Rockets to figure out what they had with Kevin Porter Jr. before they committed serious money to him. And this situation may have cost him that. And if that's the case, then it's something that he can look at and say, you know what? This did cost me potentially, some money down the line, but this organization hasn't given up on me. And if anything, that gives him an opportunity to double down, to prove to the haters, to the people that don't believe that he can succeed, right? Or that believe that he should be cut, waived, whatever, and just the Rockets should have given up on him, right? Is that he is deserving of this roster spot, that he is capable of being the point guard of the future for this Rockets team. And so they have the rest of the season to navigate that. And maybe they make a pivot this offseason. But ultimately, they're not gonna abandon this, experiment just because of this one isolated incident. And unfortunately,
look, if it is one isolated incident, okay, I don't know if it is or it isn't. I mean, I know that's the one that went public for reasons that we saw, because the guys aren't there on the bench, and that's how people kind of start sniffing around stories, and that's how stuff starts to ultimately get out. So, like, Kevin Porter Jr., though, look, Cleveland, a young developing team, like a bunch of guys, their team is all in like their 20s. They just walked away. Like they said, we're not going to, they had a guy under a very manageable contract, and they just walked away from Kevin Porter Jr. So I don't think you can kind of just say, look, it's just one time, it's one incident, not with, it's a totality of things that he's kind of brought to the table that already made one organization just wash their hands of him, and another one is now dealing with it. Like his talent, I'm not here to argue his talent. His talent's undeniable. The guy is really good. He's a really freaking good basketball player who has shown it time and again, but that's only like 50% of the battle at success in the NBA. So maybe the Rockets have seen enough over the last season and a half to feel like, look, we're getting to him. We're seeing noted improvements. We're seeing growth on a personal and professional level. We believe that in the next year and a half, when we have him under contract, we're going to get him to a place that is going to make the team, is going to make him fit into the team long term. And it just feels like a roll of the dice to me next year, when you're locked in on the young guys that are going to be part of your team long term. Like the cupboard is not bare in Houston. I wrote this. The cupboard is not robust and overflowing, but I think Green has franchise player potential. Like I've always believed in him. I was writing about him before the draft, months before the draft, about how good that guy can potentially be. Sengun, I mean, smart GMs walked away from that draft pick. Boston did. Sam Presti walked away from that draft pick. Like that was a well-identified draft pick. Tate's got some PJ Tucker a little bit to him. I mean, if you Rockets wind up in the top 3, from what I read, and I'm kind of a prisoner of what I read about the draft, Like those guys are really good. Like that, I don't know how comfortable I'd be. This is where I don't think we're ever going to agree on this part of it. But like this, I'm not sure how comfortable I'd be, bringing a contract year guy into that mix when I'm trying to, build the foundation for something that can last for the next 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right, and I think that one of the things that is so important to take away from conversations like these is you and I don't have to walk away from here agreeing on a topic. Like, I don't have to try to bend you to my will. You don't have to try to bend me to yours, but it's an opportunity for us to debate this and, kind of see each other's point of view. And so I do appreciate that, Chris. But, at the end of the day, I think that this organization, it's not, to me, it's not even like sunk cost fallacy or something where they're just like, oh, we've invested so much in them, we can't give up now. It's they've seen the flashes, they've seen the talent, it's there, and they're confident, like you said, right, that they've seen enough growth on a professional and personal level that they're confident to continue moving forward with Kevin Porter Jr. And look, at the end of the day, if something else happens, if there's another situation like this, if the red flags begin to mount with KPJ, and guess what? That option's still always on the table to waive him, to cut him, to do whatever. But I was optimistic after this that it was going to be something that was completely blown out of proportion. That's the impression that I've continued to receive from the organization, from people close to the team, and the fact that they are still very much bought in on what Kevin Porter Jr. brings to the table and very high on his future with this organization. But Chris, before I get you out of here, I got to ask you one question. I know we've been going back and forth on John Wall and now Kevin Porter Jr. So we're going to end on a less combative note. How's that? Eric Gordon, he's been playing out of his mind this season. He's having a career year, shooting a career best from three this season. Do you have any idea where would you like to see him wind up? Is there a chance that we could see him on the Celtics, do you think?
Oh God, don't get me. No, the Celtics, I don't know what they're going to do. Like they're people say like, ask me like, write more about the Celtics. I'm on TV in Boston, 3 times a week, just clobbering these guys. And like, I can't get like that Knicks game on Thursday night was, I've seen a lot of rock bottoms. That was probably it. I don't know. It's funny. Like, and I'm like most people in my position, I'm kind of into this right now, trying to assess trade markets, trade values, things like that. Usually you're getting a sense of the field for players like Eric Gordon and players like Jeremy Grant and players, and Ben Simmons a bad example, but he's another one that's going to be out there. But teams over the last few weeks, every time I talk to someone in somebody's front office, it's kind of like, yeah, we're going to get there. But like right now we're signing, we're debating Michael Beasley in our front office. Like we're trying to figure out like how we get 8 guys in uniform. So I can't say I know a specific candidate, Eric Gordon, but in a broader sense, guys that shoot the basketball are incredibly valuable. Like regardless of contract terms, they are highly sought after, and Eric Gordon can still shoot it. So there'll be a market for him if the Rockets are looking to move off him and get something back in return. I'm just at this point, I'm not entirely sure based on the triage that's going on in the NBA right now, exactly what that market's going to look like before February 10th.
Chris, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show, man. I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to sit here and go over the John Wall, Kevin Porter Jr. stuff. Thanks for stopping by, man.
I'll tell you this much too. If what you're talking about comes to fruition, if that was a turning point, if look, nobody who sits up and is like, boy, I want to just sit there and tattoo the Rockets or go after somebody else. I will be on. I promise you right now. If this team turns it around and goes on a streak, I'll be on the first flight down to Houston. I'll be down there writing about the turnaround of these guys and how these guys got it right and how it was smart to leave John Wall on the bench. I just don't see that right now. I see things from a different perspective. But if things start to pick up and things go their way, I promise you, I'll be. I forget what Marriott I stay at down there in Houston, but I'll be at one of those Houston Marriotts and I'll be at the Toyota Center covering that team.
All right, Chris, I appreciate it. I'm going to hold you to that, man. You have a good one, okay?
You got it, Jackson.
That's going to do it for another episode of Locked On Rockets, a bonus episode of Locked On Rockets. No ads, no cutaway, no nothing. As always, appreciate you checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Spotify, Google, the brand new Odyssey app, free and available on all platforms. Also, check out the show on YouTube. Search Locked On Rockets, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. As always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.